to speak for an extended period of time. And I'm going to talk about energy. Now, why energy? Well, first of all, because it's just my business. So it's a good opportunity, not exactly to tell you about my business in the narrow sense, but at least to tell you about the kind of business I'm interested in. And indeed, if anyone wants to purchase solar modules or wind turbines, please let me know at the end of the session and I can fill out an order form for you. The wind turbines, you'll have to wait a bit because we're still at the prototype stage, but the solar panels can be delivered quite quickly. But also, despite what it might appear, I want to discuss with you and describe to you in my own terms the ways in which energy issues are at the heart of community level adaptation and transformation. Not exclusively, of course, because not all energy issues are community level, but the community level is sufficiently important in current energy transitions that I think an energy focus will be useful to you in understanding some of the things that need to be achieved at the level of landscapes and territories, adapting not just to climate change or water scarcity or biodiversity pressures, but also adapting, as Carlos Alvarez Pereira was discussing yesterday, to the breakdown of a paradigm of development, a paradigm of understanding, a paradigm of education, but to the difficult emergence of alternative paradigms, plural rather than singular, which will reshape the world cognitively, epistemically, in something like the way in which new energy practices, new agricultural practices, new water practices, new transport practices will reshape the world physically and pragmatically. Now, the idea that energy challenges are at the heart of environmental transformation is pretty obvious. If you read the most recent reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, basically energy is central. Why? Because the very existence of climate change as a global phenomenon, as a set of processes that shape policy concerns for the whole global community and for every lower level community in the world, in very differentiated and contextually specific ways, is connected largely to energy use. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the work of the IPCC in the successive assessment reports covering both the physical science basis of climate change analysis and the issues to do with adaptation and mitigation. But if you're not familiar with the general orders of magnitude, as you know, climate change is connected to net emissions or rising atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, of which the most famous is carbon dioxide, but there are a number of other greenhouse gases that are of great importance and follow somewhat different paths, such as methane and nitrous oxide. About 70% of those net emissions are related to energy use, either directly, because burning hydrocarbons produces carbon dioxide and water as byproducts, and nitrous oxide for that matter, as byproducts of combustion for purely chemical reasons, and in slightly less direct ways because of the impact not just of energy use in the sense burning the fuel, but energy use in the sense structuring society through land use changes, some of which are connected to agriculture and some to the other ways in which humans inhabit the earth. The share of the drivers of climate change that is unrelated to energy is actually quite small. It involves various aspects of land use change, and at the maximum could perhaps be about 30% of the total. So when we're talking climate change, we're talking energy use. And the various other aspects of human impact on the planet in areas such as water scarcity and biodiversity are also connected to the availability of energy sources that allow humans to transform the planet on a scale that is unprecedented globally. Humans have been transforming parts of the planet, the ones they happen to inhabit, for a long time. There's an argument, you know the idea of the Anthropocene, right? The Anthropocene, the era of geological time defined by human activity as a planet-shaping process. And there's a lot of debate among specialists as to how the Anthropocene should be defined chronologically. Originally, the idea was developed by geologists. And for geologists, dating eras and epochs and so on is a matter of stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is the analysis of the way in which strata of rock are piled up on top of one another. And the key issue for geologists is how would you recognize the Anthropocene? And that requires a rather interesting exercise, which is what you could call future geology, in the same spirit as future archaeology. In other words, you have to think about what traces of human activity would remain 100 million years down the line, and would allow the hypothetical geologists of the future, working hand in hand with the hypothetical archaeologists of the future, to recognize the beginning and perhaps the end of the Anthropocene. So some of the debate, which is very interesting, not just technically but conceptually, is about markers. How would you know? And I don't know if you can guess some of the answers, but initially when the idea of the Anthropocene was proposed by Paul Crutzen in the 1990s, the assumption was that the Anthropocene would probably be best defined geologically as the age of artificial radioactive elements. There are natural radioactive elements in the Earth's crust, produced from supernovae of the past, and there are artificial nuclear elements which could only be produced by deliberate nuclear reactions, in particular military explosions. Those isotopes can be identified in the Earth's crust, and some of them will have a very long life. They will still be there for the geologists and archaeologists of the future, which means that effectively the Anthropocene starts in about 1950, when nuclear testing became a major phenomenon. But others would say, yeah, sure, but that's true. But maybe it's not the only marker, and maybe it's not the most distinctive marker. In terms of sheer quantity, it has been proposed that plastic will be the key marker of the Anthropocene for the archaeologists and geologists of the future. In which case, slightly later, probably from the 1960s, we will be able to recognize the strata of the Anthropocene, even when tectonic movements have messed up those strata so they're not neatly piled on top of one another, by the presence of very large amounts of plastic. But it's also been argued, usually by archaeologists and other people from the social sciences and the humanities, that in fact the Neolithic agricultural revolution is the moment where human impact becomes detectable, including by the transformation of natural species, which will therefore produce fossils, mineralized deposits that correspond to ancient bones or other kinds of tissues, including tissues of vegetation, and that the ability to recognize the transformation of species, the emergence of the domestic species of horse and cow and sheep and pig and so on, and dog, that define part of the human impact on nature, will allow the Anthropocene to be recognized not starting from 1950, but starting from some period around 10,000 years ago. So interesting debates. What is certain is that transformations of energy systems will end up being central to the understanding of human impact, because energy systems, which include, from the earliest stages, the use of the energy of domestic animals to supplement the natural physical energy of human beings, will turn out to be closely connected to those markers and will allow the Anthropocene to be recognized as a moment where humans, instead of simply using their own organic energy to transform their environment, became a species using external sources of energy of various kinds to transform their environment, supposedly for their own benefit, of course. The IPCC reminds us, particularly the work of Working Group 2, that what appears to be our benefit might actually have a lot of downsides. And therefore we should be careful about assuming that our increased ability to transform the planet necessarily corresponds to a net benefit, even for us, and still less for the planetary system as a whole. And clearly, while we talk mainly about fossil fuels in the context of climate change, those energy transformations are actually connected to the volume of non-organic energy, non-bodily energy available to humans. And whether that energy is fossil or not, it's transformative. I mentioned the energy of animals, which was for a very long period the main agricultural energy available to supplement human bodily energy. But humans have been using wind for a very long time as a source of energy. They've been using the movement of water, which is ultimately related to gravity. In addition, in more recent times, they've been developing the use of various kinds of fuels that can be burned to produce energy. Wood first, even before the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, as you know, the Industrial Revolution was originally based on wood. It was the ability to use wood to drive the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution that enabled the discovery of coal as an alternative. And we now live in an age where a very important part of our daily life is the use of energy, including perhaps the misuse and excessive use of energy, to transform the world, to compress time and space, to break and make things, to reshape environments around what we think might be our needs, and very often to impose what we think are our needs on others, both other humans that we don't necessarily consult about the transformations, and other non-human species that we definitely do not consult about the transformations. I think it was in a private conversation that I talked a bit about whales the other day. Not whales the country, but whales the marine mammal. Everyone knows what a whale is, right? Yeah. Whales are profoundly affected by human activity in particular because of the way sound travels in water. Which mean, and they communicate, as you probably know, by themselves using the properties of sound transmitted through water over very long distances. It's how they talk. And we increasingly are beginning to understand that marine mammals have a fairly complex, elaborated language. And indeed, experiments are now ongoing, which is absolutely fascinating, to actually try to communicate with them in their language. Scientists have developed basically sound boxes that allow the frequencies characteristic of dolphins rather than whales, but same principle. It's just that there are far more dolphins than there are whales, to be produced electronically in ways that are patterned by our analysis of the way dolphins talk to one another. And I'm sure the dolphins find this hilarious because, as you can imagine, we're probably making terrible grammatical mistakes and probably talking complete and utter nonsense, as you do in the very early stages of learning a language. But what's fascinating about this, of course, in terms of self-understanding the relation of humans to the world, is that this is going to be one of the very first times where we will be trying to speak another species' language. Something we've never done with the great apes, interestingly. We've always been obsessed with teaching the great apes our language, in particular in the form of sign language. And great apes can learn sign language. But this is changing the dynamic and trying to talk to dolphins in dolphin language. I haven't seen the results of the experiments. I don't think anything's been published yet. It's very new. But whatever the results are, including if they're simply complete hilarity among the dolphins, who we then detect talking to one another about the incredible nonsense humans appear to be speaking, it will be absolutely fascinating. If you've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, has anyone read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? No. Obscure reference. Douglas Adams. If you're interested, read it. It's a novel, but it's a clever and quite funny novel. The novel explains that dolphins are the second most intelligent species on the planet, humans being the third. I won't spoil it for you by telling you which is the most intelligent species on the planet. Anyway, the point is that marine mammals, being very attuned to sound in their particular medium, the sounds we produce in that medium become part of their soundscape, and except perhaps when we're deliberately trying to talk their language, which is incredibly new, effectively destroy that soundscape. And there's been a lot of research over recent years on the way in which shipping in particular destroys the soundscape of whales in ways that make it very difficult for them to navigate. And there are some hypotheses that a part of unusual whale mortality is very directly linked to sound. Ships make noise. The noise is a direct consequence of energy production. We are reshaping the oceans and have been since the invention of steam navigation. Did we consult marine mammals? Of course not. Could we consult marine mammals? Very interesting question, which I won't go into now because it would take me too far. It would be a whole lecture in its own right. Those of you familiar with the work of Bruno Latour in particular, which I imagine more of you are familiar with than the work of Douglas Adams, right? Bruno Latour, who's familiar with the name and content? Yeah, okay. So you should be. I would strongly recommend that you find out a bit about Bruno Latour if you're not familiar with his work. One of the key ideas, he was a very eminent French philosopher and sociologist who died in 2022 and was probably the most influential French intellectual figure of the past 20 years, perhaps even of the past 40 years, particularly outside France, the most translated French author of recent decades, profoundly influential first in the social studies of science, which he contributed with a few other people like Donna Haraway and Sheila Jasanoff to creating as a field, and then later in the environmental field, on which he wrote extensively. And one of his key ideas from the very beginning of his work was what he called, and has subsequently been called extensively in the secondary literature, actor network theory. And actor network theory is an attempt to move beyond philosophically constrained ideas of intentionality in understanding how action systems work. What this means is that while we may privilege our modes of communication in understanding how systems work, we need to recognize that every constituent of a system is interacting with every other constituent of a system in a way that is at least metaphorically linguistic and often literally linguistic. Things talk to us. Even atoms talk to us through the experiments we set up to allow them to talk to us, to tell us about their behavior. That's how we've validated the mathematical basis of quantum physics, by getting the atoms to talk to us. Animals talk to us. In a slaughterhouse, they talk very loud. It's just that we've trained ourselves not to listen, because most people never go near a slaughterhouse, they just eat the meat. And those who work in slaughterhouses are effectively inoculated against listening to the cries of the animals, because otherwise they couldn't do their job. But if you've ever seen film of a slaughterhouse or been in one, you know that the animals communicate very effectively what they're feeling, which of course is panic and pain. And whales are talking to us, including by changing their behavior and by dying, and perhaps also by desperately trying to speak to us in their language, which we cannot yet understand. Maybe once we've learned dolphin, we'll be able to learn whale. Though there are many species of whales, and they probably speak different languages, and it's going to be a hard job deciphering everything. And we don't have a Rosetta Stone. So at the moment we are in the face of those languages as we were for many centuries in the face of hieroglyphs. Knowing that they had meaning, knowing that they could in principle be understood because they were understood by the audience they were created for, but unable to understand what they meant. Until, as you know, there was a huge slice of luck with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which provided a translation. Well, translation of one text, which gave a key to understanding the whole system of writing. So the fact that energy is transformative hardly needs emphasizing. And perhaps I spent too long emphasizing it because it's just too obvious. But still, obvious though it may be, it's sufficiently important. What do I do? The free Zoom meeting is over. Having clicked OK, do I need to reopen a different Zoom meeting? Anyway, I'll let the people who know what they're doing deal with that. However, while we can easily agree that energy at the macro level is system transformative, it may be less obvious whether energy has a micro dimension, a community level dimension. And that's what I want to talk about in the rest of this talk. You could envision the possibility that energy is almost entirely a macro issue. Because of course, it's about large-scale infrastructures of various kinds, production and transmission infrastructures, producing, through various technical means, the inputs that are needed for large-scale consumption infrastructures. Electricity systems and highways and train networks and all the other things that we use energy for. Of course, within those large-scale macro systems, individual beliefs and behaviors, attitudes, institutions matter, but you might say at the margins of a system that is mostly macro-determined. And it would follow naturally from that that energy transformations are primarily seen themselves in macro terms. And indeed, this is what the IPCC and others mostly do. This is what the International Energy Agency mostly does in its regular reports. And if you open those reports, you will see that much of the material is very macro in nature. Graphs of global primary energy consumption, which is very interesting and very macro, aggregating everything together and looking just at how it's produced, what particular technology or source of energy has been used to produce the primary energy necessary for various energy systems, coal and gas and nuclear and hydro and wind and all the other things, or breaking it down by very macro level kinds of consumption, transport, agriculture, heating, and all the rest. And of course this is true. This is one picture of global energy systems. And if you follow that path, you end up with a picture of possible futures or desirable futures that's ultimately pretty simple. And whether it's the IPCC or the International Energy Agency or any other macro producer of energy visions, they will tell you, and at some level this is correct, that the energy transition is about efficiency plus sobriety, as one says in French, or frugality, as it's sometimes said in English, plus renewables. So let's squeeze waste out of the system, and there are various technical ways of doing that, which can probably achieve 15% reductions in primary energy consumption without anyone noticing the difference. Frugality, let's realize that by shaving off a very small percentage of our consumption, we can actually lose nothing in terms of individual and collective welfare. And renewables, what we need to produce once we've reduced the overall load by efficiency plus sobriety, we need much more renewables to phase out fossil fuels. At a macro level, that's true enough. But that raises a number of tricky problems. First, how do you do it? And of course, you can't do it at the macro level. The macro level is the aggregate of the decisions made at the decision level. And the decision level is quite dispersed. Decisions about building renewable capacity are dispersed all the way from individuals purchasing solar panels, as I'm sure many of you will from me straight after this talk, all the way up to utilities planning at the multi-megawatt scale additions to their grid capacity. Are you familiar with the orders of magnitude, watts and kilowatts and megawatts and so on? A watt is a joule per second, and the joule is the unit of energy in the international system of units. And for the avoidance of doubt, because my accent doesn't really distinguish the two, that's a joule not in the sense of the thing that you wear to make yourself pretty, but a joule, Joule, named after the French physicist Joule, certain amount of energy per second. So whether produced or consumed, a watt is the international unit of power or capacity. A watt isn't a lot. A typical, the light bulbs that are now banned in the European Union, the light bulbs with an incandescent filament, a typical light bulb like the one up there with that kind of power in lumens would probably be a 60-watt bulb, meaning that every second that bulb is consuming 60 joules of electrical energy to produce however many lumens it is feeding into the lighting of this particular room. So a watt's not enough. Not enough, not a lot. Typical fridge, probably about 150 watts. Typical television, probably about 70 watts and so on. So the consumption of a household is on the kilowatt scale, 1,000 watts. A typical household might at any point in time, depending on the time of day and the season and depending on the kinds of appliances that household has, be consuming something from half a kilowatt to a couple of kilowatts, household scale. A megawatt is 1,000 times more. So the megawatt scale is the scale of 1,000 households. It's also the scale of many kinds of industrial facilities that would need loads, electrical loads, or loads in the form of other kinds of energy at that kind of scale. A big coal-fired or nuclear-powered production facility would have a capacity on the gigawatt scale, 1,000 times more. The current generation of French nuclear plants have a nameplate capacity per unit of 1,600 megawatts, 1.6 gigawatts, and so on. So you can see how the scales go on. And scale is very important in any energy system. Electricity systems are designed. There's feedback from the speaker. Don't know what I can do about it. Electricity systems are designed to manage those different scales, in particular by different voltages of transmission, and that's why you see conversion stations all over the place to bring things down from high voltage transmission, which is typically at about 800,000 volts, down to low voltage transmission, and then to the kind of voltage that you need to supply your domestic appliances, 230 volts on the European standard. And then all of you, and this is new, we all carry around additional converters to bring things down to the inputs we need for our various kinds of electronic devices, which would typically have input voltages of 12 volts. And we now have the USB standard, which is 5 volts. So we're constantly managing scale by converting between scales, and energy systems are all set up that way. However, a lot of what needs to change if transition is to be achieved in the energy field is actually quite bottom-up. Efficiency is about technology, but it's also about behavior and how technology is used. And the uses of technology are never simply the consequence of the technology itself. They're the interaction between technology and how users interface with it. Sobriety or frugality is inherently a behavioral characteristic. It's about how we feel about our energy consumption. Are we comfortable with the idea of having less artificial light? Are we comfortable with the idea of using organic energy rather than inorganic, or rather bodily energy rather than stored energy to move ourselves around? Do we walk or do we drive? Depends what we're carrying. The suitcase came by car, Nuno came by foot. And that little story, which is not important in itself, is a nice metaphor. Because coming by foot with the suitcase would have been quite challenging. Coming by foot without the suitcase was easy. So the system was arranged to differentiate the transport, and we're all familiar with this. It's one of the big arguments against the bike culture, to which bike enthusiasts respond by pointing to the new kinds of cargo bikes that in principle allow anyone to have possibly 300 liters of storage, possibly more, attached to their bike, so that you can actually carry things that are quite heavy on a bike, so long as the extension is correctly attached in such a way that it doesn't mess with the momentum. And indeed, in cities, including Paris, where I live, you've perhaps noticed that increasingly deliveries are made by bikes. Bikes with attachments that can be quite big and are carrying quite a lot of kilos. So this is technology, it's infrastructure, it's social habits, it's behavior. It's a way of organizing how we relate to energy and its uses. The question of instant, immediate availability is very interesting because it's a profoundly social construction. The idea that water is available as soon as you open the tap and electricity as soon as you press the button or flip the switch is quite ingrained in our understanding of what it is to be modern, developed. And indeed, developing countries aspire to have that. But at the same time, they live in a world where it doesn't currently exist. The possibility that the tap might be dry is not some unusual catastrophe, but a quite common occurrence. The possibility that the electricity suddenly shuts off, always right in the middle of a PowerPoint presentation, is not some incredible breakdown of social order, but something that happens every day, randomly, but very frequently. And indeed, statistically, quite predictably, because it happens at times of day when the electrical load suddenly rises, often because people are starting to prepare dinner or something. I'm sure many of you have been, well, perhaps not many of you, but at least some of you have had that experience of being in a professional meeting in an African country and the power suddenly goes off. No one panics, it just happens. So the question for our ideas of modernity, and this it goes to the heart of the concept of frugality, is do we really need 99.9% reliability? Recognizing that in any complex system, and this is an engineering issue, that extra 0.9% compared to 99% reliability is disproportionately expensive. And the extra 5% compared to 95% reliability are very expensive too. You can have a much cheaper system if you accept that it is slightly less robust technically. But of course, if you renounce the robustness of the technical system, you need more social resilience to compensate. People need to be comfortable with and able to cope with interruptions of supply. And that's in people's heads as much as it is in social infrastructure and social practices. Who would be happy to occasionally not have light and power in the home if that made the whole system much cheaper and much more robust? Or conversely, who feels that the whole point of a modern energy system is energy on demand? I'm curious. Who'd like to comment? And you know that industrial consumers have been answering this question commercially for years. They have so-called interruptible contracts. They agree that they can be cut off when the utility requires it, within certain limits, certain number of hours per year, with a certain period of notice. They save a lot of money on their bill, some of which they invest in backup capacity, some of which they invest in the cost of occasional interruption of production processes. And it's a win-win situation because what the system gains in terms of avoided cost is greater than the cost imposed on the consumer by occasional interruption. But we don't do it for domestic consumers. Should we? Any thoughts? Luis? Yes. Mm. Yep. Absolutely. And that's one possible answer. We need the continuity of power, but not necessarily the continuity of network power, because we have alternative solutions. And maybe we don't need light. We can tolerate loss of light, particularly in the daytime. If we can't switch the bulbs on, we'll find another solution. But the integrity of the cooling and freezing chain is important for food safety, hygiene, and so on. And therefore, we should protect that, which is a different way of thinking about systems in terms of what's robust and what's resilient. And that different way of thinking isn't really macro. I mean, of course, it can scale up to become an altered social conception of energy systems, and perhaps it will over time. But it's also very much connected to individual action and behavior, individual patterns of consumption and perceived needs, and therefore individual ways of relating to the technology. So while there's a grain of truth in the idea that we just need to produce differently through renewables and consume less through efficiency and frugality, it's the kind of grain of truth that hides some very important aspects of what needs to be achieved. What gives us a lever is the fact that energy consumption is not in itself a benefit. This often isn't perceived. And in fact, if you look at macroeconomic studies, they often use energy consumption, particularly electricity consumption, as a proxy for economic growth and development. Because electricity production is quite easy to measure, because it's fairly centralized, and you can use it as a proxy for GDP, which is much more difficult to measure. There have even been some cruder studies which simply use light, and you've probably seen these satellite-based maps, which look at the amount of night light in particular places and how it changes over time, and use that as a pretty robust proxy for economic growth, which allows you, among other things, to check that some reported GDP figures are clearly false, either because the state producing them is cheating, which sometimes happens, or because the state has no serious capacity to measure properly. This means that, unlike in certain other areas, consuming less energy is not in itself a burden on anyone if the services provided by energy are unchanged. And the services provided by energy are basically three: heat, light, power. Power for mobility, power for physical transformation of the world through power tools and other mechanisms, power for industrial processes and so on. And if we can have the heat, light, and power from other sources, we're not losing anything. If we can have the same heat, light, and power with less primary energy consumption, we're not losing anything. The only people losing are the people who supply the energy. So certain corporations might lose out. They have no incentive to reduce primary energy consumption per unit of GDP. But honestly, who else cares? If you reduce your number of kilowatt hours consumed at home and have all the same services, you're happy, not sad. Now, there are some interesting exceptions to this, but the point I want to make is that in that respect, energy is quite different from food, for instance, where consuming food is not just to fuel your body, though it is that as well. It's also a sensory experience, a social experience. It has meaning way beyond the energy content of the food. Food isn't just fuel, but fuel is just fuel. The exceptions are where the consumption of energy, and in particular the wasteful consumption of energy, becomes a social marker. And the best example of that is vehicles. Have you noticed, everyone has, that as vehicles have become more fuel efficient, they've got heavier and bigger, eliminating all the gains of fuel efficiency. Why have they got heavier and bigger? Partly for safety-related reasons, which are partly genuine, partly fictitious. Partly because it's transformed the market for vehicles. Women like driving big vehicles where they're high above the road because it makes them feel safer. Because generally speaking, women don't feel safe on the road. And this isn't just a fantasy, it's been verified. Selling SUVs to women, both literally and indirectly in the sense that the woman determines the household choice of vehicle, has become a key aspect of the SUV revolution, which many people feel is a profoundly destructive revolution, where eventually everyone is going to have an SUV, with all the attendant problems of parking spaces, which are far too small for the vehicles, particularly underground parking, eating up all the efficiency gains by added fuel consumption through weight, and the road safety issues due to the fact that these vehicles are so high that children, people on bikes, small people, even if they're not children, are literally in the visual dead spot, the dead angle, as one says in French, l'angle mort of the driver, creating pretty significant security problems simply by vehicle size. Having successfully having adapted our cities to the automobiles of the 50s and 60s, are we going to need to readapt cities, including buildings, for the oversized vehicles of the 21st century? Did anyone see the film Super Size Me? Yep. But that's only one person. Super Size Me was about McDonald's. It was a documentary made by an American filmmaker who committed himself to eating only at McDonald's for a month and to always saying yes when he was asked whether he wanted to supersize his meal, which people selling meals in McDonald's are trained to do. And the health consequences on him were pretty dramatic, partly psychosomatic probably, but also directly organic. And the point is that the fast food business model is to sell stuff that corresponds to a reasonably normal meal, putting aside questions of quality, and then supersize it. And that's what we're doing with vehicles, supersizing them. Why does this work? And there is, as I mentioned, a distinctively marketing to women dimension, but there's also a male fantasy here. The size of a vehicle, particularly its height, the relative size of its wheels, and the general design, making every vehicle look like some kind of a military vehicle, also speaks to some pretty deep male fantasies. Fantasies about power and speed and domination. Have you seen Tesla's Cybertruck? Everyone is in the queue for it. Not everyone, but a lot of people are desperate to buy one. They're 2 years behind schedule. The waiting list is enormous. People have paid up front for something that might never be delivered. But people want it. I think it's incredibly ugly. But most American males seem to think it's incredibly desirable, which is a reminder that Europeans and Americans are quite different, and also that different people have different attitudes to lumps of metal with wheels. But it's speaking to a fantasy. So there are some cases, of which vehicles are the best example, where consuming energy for its own sake is seen as a benefit in a certain social construction of our relation to energy. Lighting is the same. Overlit commercial buildings serve no useful purpose, but they're an expression of the fact that the company is prosperous enough to waste it, as is done with food in some cultures. If you serve just enough food for the people participating in the meal, you will be seen as rude. The whole point of a meal is that you should be able to offer so much that no one can possibly finish it. Depending what culture you come from, this will speak to you more or less. If you're Swedish, you might not even understand what I just said, because the Swedes just take it for granted that you serve enough food for the people who are there. But in any Mediterranean culture, in any African culture, in most Asian cultures, excess is the whole point. So, I'm not underestimating the cultural significance of excess and the challenges in overcoming our cultural relation to excess. So what I'd like to talk about here in the second and final part of this discussion is effectively both my business model, but not because I want to tell you about my business model, and what inspires it, which is an alternative humanities-driven approach to energy system transformation. That might sound like a conflict of interest. I don't think it is, because I'm not literally trying to sell you anything, nor am I asking you to invest, though if you wish to invest in any one of my companies, I'll be happy to give you a form. But joking apart, the business model is genuinely inspired by my thoughts on energy systems, which are themselves genuinely inspired by the kinds of humanities-oriented thinking that we're discussing here in Apheleia and have been for quite a few years. It's just that I'm probably the only person in the network specifically interested in energy, but that's an accident, and everyone has their own specific interests, and if we pull them together, we make a richer network. Basically, the shift is the following. It's a shift of mindset, it's a shift of planning framework, and it's a shift of technologies. And the three things go together. The energy systems we've inherited from the 20th century, earlier energy systems had different features. Our systems were, what an energy system is distribution of centralized production. So there are certain points of production in large quantities. Those points are defined sometimes by natural resources. An oil field is where it is, so if you want the infrastructure to produce the oil, you put it on the surface above the oil field. Sometimes by more accidental choices. Where exactly to locate a large-scale power plant is often a choice dictated by various geographical considerations, but not specifically by a natural resource, unless you're talking about hydropower, which is important. But basically, what characterizes these units of production is a certain relation to scale. These are large-scale production units that are then distributed through a network that gradually scales down the technical characteristics of what's being provided to make it available to decentralized use. Centralized production, decentralized use. I mentioned the electricity system, which gradually transforms things down from high voltage to low voltage. But of course, the fuel distribution system has the same characteristics. The fuel is produced somewhere, refined in a very large refinery, of which a big country has only a handful. France currently has 6 oil refineries. The whole US has only 20-something. And from those refineries, through trucks and pipelines and so on, is distributed to various distribution points that allow that energy to be made available. The contrast, the alternative kind of system, is a system of interconnection of production-consumption nodes. And this is already technically possible. It's already starting to develop, but it's still incipient and emergent. Traditionally, decentralized production was an alternative to the centralized distribution system, not part of it. For instance, if you have a diesel generator, then that diesel generator will not be feeding power into the system. It will be allowing you to have power when the system breaks down. Or perhaps when you need a load that is greater than your commercially, contractually allowed load under the system. You have, say, as many people in France do, a 9 kilowatt subscription, and you exceptionally for some task need power beyond 9 kilowatts. You can produce it locally. But it's disconnected from the system as a whole. It's a supplement, not a constituent. What's changing with smart technologies for interconnecting production-consumption nodes with an N, as well as the increasing availability of flexible decentralized production technologies, is that instead of merely supplementing the system, there is now the technological possibility of decentralized production feeding into the system. As many of you know, that exists for solar power, for instance. You can put solar panels on your roof, install more than you need for your own consumption, and sell the excess back to the grid. That's a kind of hybrid connection where you're not exactly reshaping the whole system, but there is a degree of decentralized production going into the traditional system, which becomes, at least marginally, a two-way system. But technologically, we can go much further. With smart meters and real-time management of dispersed energy sources, it's possible to have a system that is quite radically decentralized. There might still be technical reasons to have high-capacity production facilities, and some things, in some cases, it might make sense. You can do micro hydropower, but if you want large-scale hydropower, it's large-scale by definition. If you dam a river, you can't produce electricity in very small quantities. You either do it or you don't do it. And increasingly, it's difficult even for international financial institutions to fund dams because of the level of social and environmental disruption they involve. Dams are the ultimate 1970s vision of highly centralized electricity production as the essence of development. And there are still some mega dam projects in the world. The Ethiopian Great Dam Project is perhaps one of the best known at the moment. There is a massive plan, but not a single cubic meter of concrete has been poured yet to dam the Congo River on a multi-gigawatt scale of capacity, which would potentially electrify the whole of equatorial Africa. Might get done, might never get done. If it did get done, it would have obviously considerable social and environmental implications, which many people might consider disruptive. On the other hand, China doesn't need the World Bank to fund dams and therefore has implemented its own mega dam projects with considerable vigor and technological success. Whether their success is in other terms is a separate discussion. Now, note that this is entirely compatible with climate objectives of the kind imposed by the IPCC. Sorry, bad sentence. IPCC doesn't impose anything. Of the kind that stem from the IPCC's analysis of what the international community does and from the decisions of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's important to be precise about these things. But they're not necessarily entailed by those policies, and they have a logic that is not limited to those climate policies. And that's one of the things I want to emphasize strongly. Not because I'm downplaying the significance of global climate policies and the macro level objectives, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases that go with those policies. I'm just emphasizing that there are other things going on here, including some very important territorial issues. Decentralized energy is about how territories are structured, not just about how consumers consume energy, and not just about greenhouse gases. I'll come to this in a moment, talking about the different ways of envisaging the use, for instance, of solar and wind power. Yep. So, what I'm suggesting here is first a different philosophy of energy, moving effectively from an extraction view of energy, driven by the idea of scarcity, where the challenge for humanity is to find and use energy, which, if we don't find it, will leave us destitute, deprived of the energy we need, to a circulation model, where energy is actually abundant. The question is how to harness it and what to harness it for. And this is best exemplified at the philosophical level by the development of solar, wind, marine energy, and geothermal energy, all of which are ways of capturing energy that is circulating freely within the Earth system because of the way the Earth system is set up. Marine energy is basically a consequence of gravitation and the role of the moon. Geothermal energy is a consequence of how the Earth came to be a planet. The residual heat of the Earth's production, which will continue for a very long time. Solar energy, obviously, is coming from the sun, and wind energy is a consequence of the way in which solar energy drives the climate system and interaction with the oceans. Looking at it in those terms is not necessarily an anti-fossil fuel argument. That's a separate issue. It's an argument to consider energy as the management of abundance rather than the management of scarcity. Of course, that doesn't mean energy is free, because to capture the free energy, you need infrastructures that have a cost. I didn't even mention magnetic fields, which is an area of business interest to me, which we don't have time to discuss. But there's a very big difference between saying the energy is all around us, how can we harness it? And saying energy is inherently scarce, how can we manage the scarcity? And that philosophical lens has a number of consequences for how you think about human flourishing and how you think about, as one of our slogans goes, making peace with the earth. Secondly, I want to emphasize the importance of re-embedding energy systems, which goes to the heart of community-level adaptation and transformation. Looking at energy systems not as external inputs to landscapes, territories, and communities, but as structural features of them. In fact, they already are. It's just that because energy is commodified and energy production largely hidden from community-level use, we tend to be blind to the extent to which landscapes, territories, communities are structured by energy dynamics. Making the structuring more apparent, including by decentralizing it and making it physically visible, is a way of empowering communities to make energy choices, giving the capacity to reshape themselves in different ways around the energy available to them. And this, of course, requires an integrated perspective on production along with consumption, building on the technologies that allow, as I mentioned earlier, connection of decentralized production, consumption nodes to produce a system that is more resilient and robust than the traditional centralized production flowing consumption model. And in this respect, time is too short to go into details, but you can see that there are very different ways, for instance, of using wind and solar energy in particular. We were discussing this morning with Luis in the car the way in which solar energy here in Portugal, but it's exactly the same in France and many other countries, raises concerns about the extent to which it is capturing land for centralized production of solar energy in very large quantities. And because solar energy isn't very dense, you need a lot of space to have megawatt scale solar. Now, there are some technical issues that can be resolved because solar is not single use. There are many ways of combining solar panels with agriculture on the same land. You just need a bit of imagination and creativity. We can talk about that if you're interested later in the discussion if we have time. But there are also other ways of using solar at a more decentralized level because there aren't big economies of scale in solar energy. Putting it on every roof is probably more significant than putting it all on agricultural land, for instance. And this isn't primarily a technical choice. It's a system design choice, which is also a community development choice. And communities need to be given those options, but that requires a mindset shift to even see them as options, to see it as the task of the community to think about its energy system, not simply the task of the community to ensure that its members have access to energy. That mindset shift is important. And the same with wind. There are increasing difficulties siting, with an S, obviously, wind in many European countries because wind turbines are seen as large and visually intrusive, which they are. The standard turbine that you see in European countryside these days is 3 or 4 megawatts per unit. And remember what I told you about what a megawatt means in terms